IAAIS is an operational audit framework to provide assurance and mitigate risks from AI and autonomous systems. The components of an audit framework are criteria and certification schemes. What are criteria? Criteria are a set of questions to evaluate if an AI or autonomous system is ethical, unbiased, privacy compliant, secure, and trustworthy. The criteria encompass 5 pillars, namely ethics, bias, privacy, cybersecurity, and trust, helping manage all risks to humans from these systems. Now let's get to the next part. The sum of criteria together form a scheme. Once a scheme is approved by regulators, it can be used to certify a company's compliance. Are you still confused? Here is an example. The UK Children's Code expects organizations to consider the best interests of the child while providing online services for children. In this context, a criterion is to verify whether the company's ethics committee examined, considered, deployed, and disclosed risk mitigations to protect the best interests of the child. We are examining whether the ethics officer considered critical aspects. At ForHumanity, more than 450 contributors and 37 fellows are crowdsourcing criteria to mitigate risks from AI or autonomous systems. Everything to build an infrastructure of trust for you. Now, let's go deeper about how IAAIS helps build an infrastructure of trust. An infrastructure of trust relies on auditors abiding by 3 rules. ForHumanity certified auditors are trained, knowledgeable, objective, and they commit to abide by the Code of Ethics. Second, audits are based on ForHumanity criteria and are applied independently and objectively. Finally, audit is done on behalf of people and not on behalf of the companies that pay their fees. You can trust them to work for you because ForHumanity auditors abide by the Code of Ethics, which establishes professional responsibility and accountability. IAAIS enables the building of the infrastructure of trust through governance, accountability, and oversight. The key is that each of us has a role to play in protecting humanity with the infrastructure of trust. Join us by contributing to IAAIS to mitigate risks from AI and autonomous systems. Want to know more? Please visit us at forhumanity.center.
What is an infrastructure of trust? An infrastructure of trust is designed to help the public, help a party that has no ability to get into the details to know and feel confident that a set of audit rules and audit criteria are being met. This is how this works. Auditors work with targets of evaluation. So they're going to conduct the audit with that target of evaluation over dedicated systems or group of systems. The nature of that auditor needs to be independent. And what independence means, Sarbanes-Oxley is the law that defines that in the US, and there are other laws around the world that govern this, but not every country has them. What the law of independence says is that as the auditor, with this target of evaluation, you may get no other monies by working with that target of evaluation. You may provide no consulting, no advice, no strategy, no systems, no pre-audit compliance, no nothing. So you have no positive remunerations except your audit fees. And in working with that target of evaluation, there must be this tension, and this tension is this, that if there is false assertions of compliance, in other words, there's a compliance rule, the target of evaluation or the system hasn't met that rule and that criteria, but if the auditor says that they have, that they wear liability for that false assurance. And here's why that's crucial. Because if the public knows, or the public can understand, or it's dictated by law on behalf of the public, which is great too, and what we do in financial audits and financial accounting, then the public knows that when an auditor issues a report that says target of evaluation has complied with all of these rules and criteria, you know what they believe? They believe it's true and that these criteria have been met, because there is no reason for the auditor to assert compliance where it doesn't exist. There's no monetary remuneration whatsoever, and in fact, they wear risk and they wear liability if they say that there's compliance and there is not. That tension, there's no feedback loop between the auditor and the target of evaluation. They simply conduct the audit. Have you done all of these things according to the criteria? And when the entity has done that, then compliance can be issued and be trusted upon by the public. This is the centerpiece of an infrastructure of trust. And it has to be done with two other key elements. It has to be done by certified practitioners who are trained in this criteria. And number two, the criteria must be independent, third party. It can't be provided by the auditor. It can't be the rules of the auditor. That's an inherent conflict of interest as well. So you have to have these three key elements to have a proper relationship between an auditor, a target of evaluation in an infrastructure of trust. Certified practitioners, independent third-party rules, and the audit must be done not for, not with the company, but done over the company on behalf of the public, on behalf of intended users, third parties. This is how we build an infrastructure of trust.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this session that is looking at our independent audit of AI systems with our ForHumanity Fellows group. So welcome everyone, welcome to the Fellows. My name is Jo Stansfield. I am a ForHumanity Fellow myself. Great honour to actually be speaking with the other Fellows today and learning from all of their expert points of view about independent audit of AI and autonomous systems. So we heard a little intro from Ryan just there. We're going to start off digging a little deeper about what is meant by independent audit, what our process is as ForHumanity, what it means actually to be a contributor and fellow. But then the main body of what we'll talk about today are the 5 pillars that underpin our audit. That is ethics, bias, privacy, cybersecurity and trust. And I'm delighted to welcome each fellow who is an expert in each area, and we'll hear from each of these in a lot more detail about each one. So it's my hope you'll come away from this learning a lot more about what is meant by audit and having a much deeper understanding of it. So I'd like to just start before we get going to just ask you all a little question about yourselves. So if we can make the first poll live, please, Anna. Would you please let us know, what is your current opinion? What is your point of view about independent audit of AI and autonomous systems at this stage? So I'll just give you all a few minutes to find the poll tab. While you're looking at it, I'll give you some orientation of what is where on the screen, so some housekeeping while it's done. You'll see at the top of the screen on the right-hand side, always very bad at this right and left business, there's a link for if you have any issues, you can use this to get any help. Across from here, you'll see tabs for chat, Q&A, the polls, and you'll see the member list here too. So please scroll across to the polls section, and just waiting for that poll to go live. and let us know, what is your current perception about independent audit of AI and autonomous systems? Okay, so this isn't the poll that I'd intended, but we can answer this one now. So let's find out a bit about you in terms of what your current involvement is. Are you already an auditor or a pre-auditor? Is it something that you're considering to become in future? Is your organisation subject to an audit? Are you interested in the possibility of that happening? Some other interest, or actually you have no involvement yet with independent audit of AI systems? Great, so we're seeing these results coming in. Thank you all for taking part. We're going to make this session as interactive as possible if you've not picked this up yet. So we'll be asking you questions. We'd like to learn about you as well as you learning about us and the work that we're doing at ForHumanity. So I think we have lots of results now, not seeing too much change. So the summary, we have some people who are already auditors or pre-auditors, about 10% of us, 10% something else, 20% interested in the possibility of audit for their organisations, and 40%, a large number of us, a significant minority, actually interested to become an auditor or pre-auditor. So thank you all for sharing this. So this structure of this session will be quite straightforward. We'll ask some predetermined questions for the panelists. We'll spend probably about 45 minutes with those questions, and then there'll be lots and lots of time for you to all ask questions at the end of the session. So please use the Q&A tab to ask your questions if anything occurs to you as we go on. Looking at the audience in the previous sessions, I can see that you've all discovered very well already how to make use of the chat and the Q&A, so please keep doing that. You know, we've got a great opportunity here to really hear some in-depth answers and some expert considered opinions about what, you know, whatever you would like to know about independent audit of AI systems. So without further ado, let me move on to introduce our panelists. I'll do this in order that I see people on screen. So Enrico, would you like to introduce yourself first?
I'm an ethicist. I studied philosophy and I've always worked in the ICT sector, so I'm kind of a bridge between technologies and the humanities and the philosophical approach of ethics. And lately I've been collaborating with ForHumanity for building a code of data ethics and other stuff we are doing together, like audit schemes, etc. And in the other part in France, I'm part of the AFNOR as a co-chair for AI-enhanced nudging. And so we are proposing a standard for the EU about AI-enhanced nudging. And I don't want to take a lot of time talking about me because everybody has got LinkedIn, so you can see our profile on LinkedIn and we'll have the time to talk about the real subject, the ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrico. So Sarah, I'll hand over to you. Would you please spend a couple of minutes to let us know about you?
Sure. I'm a governance, risk and compliance person, and I've done that through IT security, information security, then moved into data protection, and I always had a really deep interest in AI, the potential and the downside risks, and ended up coming to ForHumanity as a result of that. And I was probably dealing with governance, risk and compliance at scale at a time when not many other people were, having come from the technology space. So I could see challenges trying to operationalize this stuff coming at people very fast, and that's why I'm here and what I've tried to help with in this sphere. And I've taken a great interest in how we can nimbly apply some sort of triage to what we do, and generally try to manage risks in a useful way.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here, Sarah. Andy, I see you next in my order of going around the screen. Please, would you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Joe. Hi. Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm greetings from Northern California. I'm Andy Grotto. I am the founding director of the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance at Stanford University, where I also serve as the faculty lead for the cyber policy specialization we offer through our international affairs graduate program. Before coming to Stanford, I spent many years in the U.S. government in various positions, most recently as the Senior Director for Cyber Policy of the National Security Council at the White House. Really excited about the conversation we're going to have this morning and beyond.
Thank you, Andy. Trish, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. My name's Trish Shaw. I'm CEO and founder of Beyond Reach Consulting Limited, which is an AI and data ethics consultancy. Largely, to Sarah's point, I'm a legal compliance and risk and governance girl. I'm 20 years a tech lawyer in my background, 13 years of which I spent in-house for a global data company. And my kind of area, I suppose, I operate in is this intersection, this space between technology, policy, law and ethics, and sort of bringing that all together really for organisations. Like the other participants today, I'm a ForHumanity Fellow. I'm also chair of the Society of Computer Law here in the UK, where I'm placed. I'm on the board of the International Tech Law Association, and I'm on the steering committee of Women Leading in AI. So I've got a few strings to my bow, but we bring all of us our own natural skill sets into the ForHumanity space to help make AI trustworthy fundamentally.
Wow, thank you, Trish. Shea, last but not least, over to you. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of Babel AI, and Babel intends to be an independent auditor of AI systems. But like a lot of people, I realize that we can't set the rules ourselves, and so that brought me to ForHumanity, and I realized that there has to be some independent body that puts the rules together. And so I'm a ForHumanity Fellow, and I contribute to the audit rules and overall running of ForHumanity, and really excited to hear the partake in the discussion today.
Great, thank you, Shea. Me too. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. So without further ado, let's dive in. So, first up, what is an independent audit of AI and autonomous systems? Trish, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks so much, Joe. So fundamentally, AI audit is about building trustworthiness into the system, isn't it, really? This is a after the fact, ex post, as we would say, set of checks that corroborates what's gone on before. How has the governance been put in place? How have you controlled your systems? Where have you put your risk and controls and your access points in place? And these are all measures that an independent auditor comes in to look at and assess and corroborate, and then come out hopefully with some kind of element of either certification or proof that they've done what they said they were going to do. So in terms of AI audit itself, and what we stand for as ForHumanity, there's three kind of key characteristics to this, and these were pointed out by Ryan a little bit earlier on in the pre-talk, but AI audit has to be done by certified practitioners. These are people who are independent, who have been brought to the table and have been trained. Secondly, it's the use of these third-party rules, and by bringing those third-party rules by a separate rule-making body, it brings objectivity and rigor to the conversation. This is about compliance to something, and that something is created by a third party, and that brings about an element of uniqueness to that particular setup. And the third aspect is the relationship of audit. Unlike consultants who are kind of brought in to help strategize and implement and bring forward operations in an organization, an auditor goes in, as I say, after the fact often, and they're reflecting, they're reviewing, they're corroborating what they see, and they're reporting on it. This is a kind of unique relationship. Yes, they often get brought in as service providers, but there isn't kind of this aspect of where they come alongside the business to help the business. It's more of a place where they're doing this third-party corroboration for on behalf of another body. Now, in our instance, we're trying to do this for and on behalf of the public wider to give out public trust. But this, traditionally has been for a regulator or for a third-party standards independent industry body. So fundamentally, it's those three aspects. It's the certified practitioners, it's the use of independent third-party rules, and ultimately it's this unique relationship with the auditor itself as well. And this all is about providing assurance, fundamentally, to build that trustworthiness.
So really this all comes down to it being for humanity, exactly as the name of the organisation. So Sarah, can you talk a little bit about why it's so important that we have independent audit of AI systems?
Well, it's mainly because there are so many different competing motivations. There are so many competing pressures on everybody that's working in this space. It has such enormous commercial promise. It has such enormous scientific promise. It has so much enormous humanitarian promise. But there's always a fundamental tension between quick, cheap, secure, ethical. We have to be able to manage those tensions on behalf of the people who are not in the room. And people need to get paid. People need to make a return on their investment. We need to operate on the other side of that scale to rationally and pragmatically look at balancing the excesses that can occur when you are perhaps operating in favor of maximizing return, maximizing growth, maximizing data acquisition. So that's why an independent audit is critical, and why there are sometimes too many tensions and difficulties with in-house governance, I would suggest.
Thank you, Sarah. Now I can see that there's some questions in the chat already, which is very relevant to the discussion now. First one, how is an AI audit different from an AI impact assessment? What are the differences that we can describe here? Who would like to take this one?
I'll take this one if you don't mind, Joe.
And
maybe Shea might like to bid in as well. But from my perspective, an AI impact assessment is something you do ex ante, so ahead of actually providing a service, an AI system into operation. It's at the design, the development, the deployment, and ongoing monitoring stages where you're kind of governing this with, because you want to know its impact. You want to have a set of scenario plans in place to manage and mitigate your potential risk factors that are going to be in play there in the scenarios. Useful as perhaps a ex post, so after the event tool, but really you don't want to be doing anything until you understand what the impact is. So that's the kind of crude differential, I would say.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the most obvious one is the compliant versus non-compliant. So you can do an impact assessment, which is very useful and something that you might, in terms of an audit, require someone to do. So the audit version of that is, has this entity conducted the impact assessment, and does it fit with the standards that have been set up for compliance? And I think that's really the biggest difference, because anyone could do an impact assessment, and whether it's a good one or not is going to depend on standards, and an audit can ensure that those standards are met as long as there are binary criteria for compliance that we can follow.
Shea, you raise a point that I think could benefit from some further clarification, which I wonder will be on people's minds. How does audit relate to standards bodies, for example, ISO accreditation? What is the relationship between our independent audit and those standards bodies?
Well, I mean, I think what ForHumanity tries to do is well, several things. One is that we try to translate law into audit criteria where there's law that's applicable, and where there isn't law or there's vague law, the best thing we can do is to look at best practices or standards that are out there that can mitigate these risks. And so ForHumanity is drawing from all of the standards that we think are going to be successful at being A, translated into audit criteria, and B, actually be successful at mitigating the risks that we're worried about. And so I think that all of the standards bodies have material that we can draw from, and some more than others. But I think that's what I see, at least, as the interaction and the role that these standards bodies play with ForHumanity.
Yeah, that's a very helpful answer. Thank you. So really the scope of the ForHumanity audit is, across multiple standards, as we talk about, diverse inputs, multi-stakeholder feedback. Actually, this is one example of some of the diverse inputs to that audit and the scope of that audit potentially. So let me ask you another question. If AI audit is really about looking at systems that are under development, what is the role for systems that are already on the market? Do we have a role for audit for systems that are already out there? And I think there was some fascinating discussion around this in the previous regulators panel. Would anyone like to talk about the role of audit for systems that are already deployed?
I can take that one. I think with the good thing about the AI Act that's just come out, the EU AI Act, is that it's got continuous monitoring baked into that as a requirement, where just the nature of most of these systems is they're continuing to learn, they're continuing to take feedback loops, layering correlations into the next level of calculations and weightings for the next level of outcomes. So there's an essential change over time. It may move it away from the fitness for purpose for the particular population it's directed at. It may move it away from being fit for purpose for the very practical task it's being asked to perform. How that would work with audit is having a triage mechanism that calls you back in to reassess potentially a subset of controls that were pertinent to that delta, pertinent to what had changed over time. And also with any governance, it's out of date the day you finish it. Therefore, you're always going to want to repeat, because the world, the threat environment, the geopolitical environment is going to change around that AI as well. So that's how I would suggest the two things intersect, and the process to re-engage, and how we look at persistent accountability through supply chains and after delivery into production, or after sale, or after acquisition, or after merger, is a challenge we're all trying to tackle.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'd like to move us on and ask you all, about the process of creating the independent audit. Would somebody like to describe what is ForHumanity's process? How is the audit being developed? Shea, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, so the overall, so as I mentioned before, I mean, the main sort of driver, or at least the guiding principle, is taking existing law, which is meant to protect people's rights and interests, trying to translate that into auditable criteria that we can, as auditors, audit, let's say, vendors or people who are producing or deploying AI. But the spirit of ForHumanity is a lot different. That's sort of the process that we go through, but really collaboration, openness, that's the hallmark, I think, of ForHumanity. Anyone can join, multi-stakeholder. It doesn't really matter what your background is. We want you to participate in the process. If you have a voice and if you have some interest in participating in how AI is going to be rolled out in the future and how it affects you, you have a voice in the process. And that's really something that I feel like sets us apart. In addition to the fact that we don't have corporate interests, we don't take corporate money, everyone's volunteering. These are people who care. And so the process is clear. We need to make these auditable criteria. We need to search out as many voices as possible. And we're always looking for best practices. What are the best practices in this really rapidly evolving field? And to me, that sort of sums up ForHumanity and the power, I think, of the process that we're partaking in.
Yeah, the crowdsourced approach is unique as far as I've ever come across. An amazing approach with these diverse inputs that we value so highly. So a question for someone who's not spoken yet, perhaps. How would someone go about becoming a contributor, and what kind of role may they be playing in the audit?
I can take that one. Just dive right in. Jump right in. It's that simple.
I agree with Andy. It's exactly the same. And I can add that I'm maybe the only one is not an English native speaker. And so sometimes it's more difficult for people that are not native English speakers to come in, to take their word, their stage, and to raise their voice. But I found my space, and a lot of people that are not native speakers can raise their voice and make them being understood in the community. So I think it's a good way to participate and to collaborate with ForHumanity.
Would any of you like to share a recent piece of work that you've been involved in and the type of things that were involved?
Well, I already shared in the chat the work I've been involved in lately, and I've been working on the code of data ethics. In reality, it's thanks to the fellows and the contributors of ForHumanity that I developed the idea that inside companies there was a latent space, there wasn't well defined, and it was the space of data ethics. And starting from that, I tried to, and with the collaboration of many of you, I tried to find how the accountability for data ethics should be spread in the company. And what at the end we realized was that when we are talking about ethics in a company, we are talking about a business framework of ethics and not a data framework of ethics. So it's a completely different approach, because while the ethics is related to the relation outside the company and inside the company between people, data ethics change completely the level of abstraction, and you are working on detail of data. Then algorithms and artificial intelligence, it's a powerful way of treating data, but the base, the stake in a informational mature society are data. And so we have to change the approach with data and to create a specific code of data ethics related to data, to have a specific chief data ethics officer that is endorsed to be accountable for the data ethics of the company. And at the same time, we have to develop the environment where everybody can reason in an ethical way. But I have shared it in the chat, so I'd be great to have a feedback from the contributors and the people are listening now. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrico. Yeah, please check out the link. I've had a read of the document this morning, and it's very comprehensive, well-structured document. So highly recommend it. And Enrico, what you bring up leads us nicely actually onto our key topics for the session, which are our pillars of independent audit. And our first pillar is ethics. But a key facet of audit is that it's binary. You comply or you don't comply. But ethics is, known for not being quite so straightforward as this. There's no right answer to ethics. So how do we go about auditing for ethics?
Well, the point is that we cannot decide if an ethical choice is right or wrong, because it would be a law. So you'll be able to quantify the value of a choice. What we can do with audit, and what we are trying to do, is verify that the environment created around the company is good enough to make ethical decisions. And for doing this, we are simply asking companies if they are well trained in data ethics and the ethical problem related to algorithms, or if they have the time to do it, just to avoid to have kind of ethics washing where everybody tries to start to talk about ethics, but nobody is competent to take decision about it. And I came from philosophy, and I know that not every philosopher is adapted to work in data ethics, because you must have some technical competence to understand the risks that you have treating data and making the use of algorithms. And the thing that I would say is that the importance of data ethics is so strong that now we are working like full people trying to minimize the risk, because in reality data change our reality. It's much more than another technology. They, in philosophy, we say they are re-ontologizing our reality. And AI is making data even more powerful. So the point is that that's why we aim participating and want to create a better world for AI, for our environment and our infosphere, for our infosphere to develop and to flourish in a better and ethical way.
Thank you, Enrico. Sarah, when we talked about this before, we had some conversation about how ethics can be operationalized. I wonder, is there anything that you would like to add on that topic?
Yeah, very much so. I've hit this challenge before dealing with data protection, because data protection is on behalf of data subjects. It's not on behalf of the business. That's why a data protection officer should have independence, and the intersection is very tight. And the thing that's always being asked for is a more typical financial risk management outcome. You know, what is my percentage probability? What is my potential dollars impact? And things like ethical choice fundamentally resist that, because they are fundamentally context dependent and qualitative outcomes. They are based on opinions, they are based on morals, they are based on individual, group, cultural, societal, geopolitical factors that differ from day to day almost. So the adequacy of a set of controls which we have cumulatively, looking at the best thinking out there, help to reduce the residual risk that you're going to make poor ethical choices. So you can't dictate what's right or wrong in a given ethical environment. But what you can do is you can look at those indicators of adequate control. Are they there or are they not? Are those controls around things like validity and proportionality and explainability and necessity, are they operating? Are they operating at a systems level? Are they operating with the decision-making structures they feed into should an adverse outcome potentially be identified? Those kind of checks and then referrals into governance are all reflected in the criteria and in what we haven't talked about yet, which is the body of knowledge, which adds meat onto the bones of the best current thinking about that. Those indicators for when is a control potentially sufficient to pass the audit, when is it insufficient, when is it mature, and how might you get to maturity if that's where you're aiming for. And if it doesn't matter if you can't quantify in dollars and cents what the impact is, as long as you can create some reasonable standardization in your outcome, so you can compare one AI to the other, as if it's apples to apples, not apples to kangaroos. This is the ultimate challenge with ethics. It's not a bunch of meeting notes that come out of a cozy chat. It is criteria, and it is indicators, and it is how close are you to good practice. So you can make a substantiated qualitative judgment on how many of those fronts you are succeeding on. And that's how we're working to operationalize.
Fantastic, thank you. And you mentioned the body of knowledge. I think this would be a good moment to talk a little bit more detail about what that is, and maybe some examples and how this relates to the audit criteria.
Sure. I mean, anybody who's been in any kind of audit, and usually it might be IT general controls audit or financial audit, you have the risks that have spawned the audit requirements, and then you have more granular questions, and then you have the indicators or the objectives, which are, is this in place? Is it designed to be fit for purpose? Is it operating as designed? Is it always operating as designed? So the body of knowledge, and then you have evidentiary requirements, and the body of knowledge is providing that extra level of detail. At the pure surface audit level, it's like, are you doing it or are you not? Pass, fail, to give that degree of certainty. Under the hood are the things that feed into that and the next level of detail and granularity. And all of this is a movable feast. We are operating at the bleeding edges of practical usage of a lot of these technologies. But the thing we have is even people taking ownership of a knowledge store, something like a code of ethics, something like risk analysis, something like human in the loop, what counts as a good look for that, things around validity, necessity, proportionality. There's a lot of meat on the bones underneath that in knowledge stores. Someone takes control of that. They may not be the global expert in that, but what they do is go out and source the best current knowledge for that it's a great way to make yourself somebody who's highly respected in the industry, is to take a knowledge store ownership role, because you've got an excuse to go and knock on the door of all the people you'd really like to speak to about this stuff. It's one of the reasons I'm here, because, you know, I knew that there were risks to manage, and I felt that I was pretty much on the money, but I really needed to get around the people like those people on the call and fill in the gaps in my knowledge, learn the language, find out if I was missing it, and bringing my reusable skills to the table, which is really what we're inviting everyone to do. And the body of knowledge is a really great vehicle to do that.
And for people to get involved, Sarah, I presume it's you that they should speak to once that they are involved as contributors.
Yeah, it can be. There's myself. We've got Josh Boucher, which is one of our fellows as well. Ryan is still a great contact, but we're trying to keep a little bit off his plate. What you can do is come in and through the website, ForHumanity.center, say you'd like to be involved. You'll get directed if you say you'd like to look at something to do the body of knowledge. We've got a Slack channel you can join. We've got videos to help you understand where we are and let you look at the lists of things we're doing at the moment. And if you see a gap, you suggest it, and then we create somewhere for you to store your knowledge in a store. So yes, that's how you do it.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So should we move on to the next of our pillars, which is bias? So Shea, what steps can be taken to mitigate bias within AI on autonomous systems?
So that's a really tough question, and I sort of cringed when you mentioned that we're experts, or at least that I'm an expert in bias, because bias is a really difficult thing to detect. It's a difficult thing to mitigate, and we really don't know as a field, even though there's been a lot of work in the fairness, accountability, and transparency and machine learning community on fairness and looking at adverse impacts due to bias in machine learning. We really don't know what it is or where it can hide. And so the question, how do we best mitigate it? It's really the things that are listed in the name of this conference, you know, accountability, transparency, governance, oversight. Those are the key things, because we don't know where it's going to hide. And so you have to have transparency. So you have to have transparency with the organization. Groups have to be talking to each other. You have to know what's been done to the data before it got put into training, for instance, or how the data has changed as you're retraining a model. You have to have accountability. So you have to know who actually said that that was okay, that the data was sufficiently, let's say, representative enough to begin training of a model. That accountability, you have to have people's names against tasks and people who stand by their decisions, these ethical choices that they make as they develop the product or as they maintain a product. Governance, you have to then have a group of people within an organization who are really keeping an eye on what's going on, and that doesn't just spring up out of nowhere. That has to be taught. It has to be practiced and maintained. And so these are the kind of things on an outward level or a broad level that you do to mitigate bias. But awareness is probably the biggest thing. You have to be able to have an awareness of the risks and the risks of creating bias when you are working with data and when you're working with algorithms. And so you have to be talking to the developers, the machine learning engineers, the people who work on the ground with the data. And they have to be able to talk to you, and you meaning whoever you are in your organization trying to mitigate this, right? So I think bringing everybody up in terms of speaking a common language, understanding common technique for mitigating and detecting bias, that's where we're at. And this is really, despite the fact that this field has been around for a few years, AI is moving at such a pace that we have to be very diligent with keeping up with all the recent developments and in order to mitigate this. So that's not a satisfactory answer probably, but the short answer is it's really hard, and you basically have to do everything you possibly can to be on top of it.
Thank you, Shea. So what are the key ways that bias can get introduced? What should the developers and implementers of AI systems be looking out for?
Is this also to me, or does somebody else want to?
Anyone who'd like to answer, if you'd like a breather.
Well, yeah, I'll let somebody else if they want.
Sudden silence. I think showing it is hard, Shea. There's no simple answer to where is it introduced. So if we think
I'll jump in a little bit. Yeah, I was going to say it latches into different stages of the life cycle. The OEC, the life cycle, is a good one to look at. We follow that reasonably closely in the way we define the stages. So it's in the selection of the data and the people who select it. It's in the model design. It's in the people who are funding it. It's in the people who train it. It's in the data that's used to train. It's in the implementation into the organization to use it. And it's in the tuning and the post-market monitoring and how you're using the outcomes of all of those things, how well you choose to manage exceptions. All those things can integrate bias, and as well as from within the system, where it's perhaps a learning model where it's layering in bias that you maybe didn't foresee from an input. It's creating new layers based on who defined and tuned the weighting within the system, for instance. So there are input points all along the way. All you can do is benchmark against your population and your definition for a desired outcome. Obviously, the ticklish place is we are designing AIs for imperfect worlds with their own implicit bias in the meat space. And who is defining what good looks like if you're not happy to just replicate what you're living with already? Because part of the promise is that AI is agnostic of our influences, which is obviously not true. It's always a function of the environment it's delivered in, but that's where the ethical choices and management of risk around poor ethical choices and poor management of adverse outcomes comes in. So it's layered.
Yeah, this relates nicely to Enrico's paper, in fact, with the different layers of kind of accountability and responsibility in an organization. And actually, one thing I've seen, in my many years working in tech, and recently, as more and more, developers, software engineers, technical people are getting involved in AI and autonomous systems. Actually, that growth in the understanding of the ethics and the roles and responsibilities that they play, and the responsibility even at the organization level, is still very mature. That's not something that's seemingly very well understood yet. So what kind of governance can we put in place to actually help to mitigate these risks in an organizational kind of a way?
I'm happy to jump in there as well. Obviously, you have a multi-layered, multifaceted, multidisciplinary approach as a kind of a bog standard basic. As much diversity of thought and of ethnicity and other protected characteristics in that room, because people see it from different angles. I think having people from different cultures and jurisdictions also helps to understand kind of some of the impacts on that different population, on that different context space. So I think that's quite an interesting starter for 10. And also being mindful that everyone brings with them their own potential for bias. So understanding that what you've perhaps already managed to mitigate could be reintroduced. And so not just because of the data you're looking at, but also because of the people who are assessing and looking and reviewing and putting things back into the situation because they couldn't necessarily see the reasoning and the ontology, to Enrico's point earlier on, as to why something was done the way it was done. So therefore the need for explanation at every single phase, but not just in a language you understand, but in a language that is going to be understandable and translatable to your other colleagues in their particular professions and disciplines. And I think that, coming to Shea's point earlier on, is this trying to pull together a common language where you're explaining it from a statistician to a lawyer, and they both understand what fairness is, for example. What does a fair outcome look like, and what's fair in stats might not be fair in the law, for example. But that kind of brings me quite nicely into thinking about where we have the challenge with bias, and the challenge with data that Shea highlighted on is with data minimization, because the reality is we know AI and machine learning is data hungry, and the more data we can feed it, sometimes the more accurate, or the idea is that it'd be more accurate, or the kind of more knowledgeable the results that we can see. But the challenge is, from a privacy perspective, you've then got potential for overreach. And so how do you balance data minimization versus the overreach into someone's life and being?
Nice segue, Trish, into the next of our pillars, which is privacy. And of course, the data protection is a very important element of this. Can you talk a bit more about the responsibilities and ramifications of using personal data in AI systems, particularly with regarding that personal sensitive data that's involved?
Indeed. So when we're talking about privacy, and just before kind of carry on, because I really want to make sure people have a clear definition of what privacy is in people's mind, it's potentially the right to be left alone. It's the right to be free from intrusion and interference. Now, that doesn't immediately conjure up in one's mind data or data protection, particularly actually stateside, where historically...
You're breaking up a little, Trish.
Oh, sorry, can you still hear me? So where historically privacy had been really embedded in, don't come and knock on my door, don't overreach, don't conflict with my confidentiality. Whereas in Europe, we've had First World War, Second World War, we've had the emergence of human rights and basic human rights at a European level, following kind of 1945, 1946 and 1949. And that's brought in the concept of data and data privacy into the mix. And so when we're talking about privacy, we need to be talking about it holistically. So then coming to the point about AI systems and where privacy could be intruded, if you like, at that point, it could be intruded in your data. So this is where data protection is super important, but that only covers you so far as your data is personal data. But there could be data about you that may not be personally identifiable, might be anonymized, might be pseudonymized, might be even synthetic. So looking at particular characteristics that are similar to yours, but actually aren't actually you and aren't identifiable to you. So we've got the data aspect of privacy. We've also got the models that are created, and what is that model looking to say? How is it optimizing? How is it categorizing? Is that then having an impact on how privacy is seen, what insight is being given, what kind of inference is being chosen? And some of that might be in the measurement, some of that might be in the selection. And then thirdly, we're then looking at the AI system itself. What is that itself doing? How is it treating the data? How is it operating on the models it's been fed? What are the kind of outputs it's going to churn? And is that appropriate? Is that invading privacy? Is that overreaching into someone's life? And then finally, it's kind of I've mentioned the outcomes, but with the outcomes, it's also the people around it, because fundamentally, it's not just about one individual here. We know that AI optimizes and it classifies and it categorizes. So you may well be an individual impacted by something, but you may not know it's actually the AI or some kind of automated decision-making system that's done this about you. Actually, it may affect an entire group of people who look like you. It might not be uniquely personal, or not intentionally uniquely impersonal. It might be an unintended consequence, but it might not just impact you, it might impact an entire group. So privacy then becomes something that is much more holistic. It's not just about free from intrusion as an individual. It's actually freedom from intrusion and the right to be let alone, if you like, and free from interference as a potential population of people. And that could be a subpopulation of a population.
That's an interesting link to Shea's points about bias as well. I think with the disparate impacts to different populations and how privacy has implications there as well.
And we certainly need to be moving away from the kind of conversation where people are saying, well, I've nothing to hide. Isn't privacy about confidentiality? I think it is about keeping things confidential. That's a part of it. But it's also about what you are wanting people to know about you, or to infer about you, or to think they have as insight about you. So fundamentally for me, privacy is about boundaries and about people being empowered and having control to set those boundaries about information, insight, inference that's being drawn about them, and how then this ultimately goes on to impact decisions. Because this could be, it could impact of whether or not you get a job, whether or not you get a university place, whether or not you get healthcare treatment of a particular kind, based on some of the decisions that can ultimately be the information and meaning that can be inferred from data that is fed into it. So that's why I've mentioned about the holistic approach, because here privacy is about all aspects of your life. It's not just your data, but it's about how you live your life, whom you live your life with, your relationships, whether they be online or offline, your habits, your movements in some cases. So this is where it comes beyond the idea of it's just data, it's just your online life. This is about your offline life, and things that we need to consider, including, you know, anything from kind of CV, talent management, right through to populations and traffic movement and smart cities. So we're really seeing a big spectrum of how privacy is going to be a much bigger conversation going forward.
Thank you, Trish. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add on the topic of privacy?
Just a little thing. Thank you. I'm sorry, but
I think actually probably segues.
Huh?
Okay.
Okay, Trish just talked about the empowerment, and this is a small trick that big companies used during all this year. They wanted to empower people to do things too difficult to choose. So please take the decision of your privacy, but you are not prepared enough to take a decision for your privacy. So it's a trick not to protect the privacy of people. So it's very important what she was saying, because it's not the problem of distributing your information. I go to e-commerce, and for years I tell to the e-commerce what kind of book I like. That's fine. The problem is that after 15 years, I realized that all the suggestions of this e-commerce just shaped my vision of my life, because they suggested all the same books, and they reduced the multidisciplinarity and the openness of my mind. So that's the problem of privacy, not only to protect your personal data or your ID number. It's just to build your own reality. And for us, we came from a physical generation. We studied in the libraries, but for new generation, that means that they are just entering in a kind of funnel, epistemological funnel. They are knowing what the technology wants them to know. So that's why we are fighting for humanity to protect the new generations.
And can I add a point? I love Trish's phraseology around setting boundaries. I hadn't heard that before, and I think it's a really insightful way to think about privacy and data protection. I will add that this topic in particular, sort of straddles the line between ethics and the more technical sort of, elements of safety, for example. Different cultures, different legal traditions have different orientations towards privacy and data protection. And what I love about the boundaries formulation is, if you we haven't had much opportunity to travel globally over the last year, but if you've been to other countries, right, where people have different traditions of personal space, of how people interact, you could those same sort of cultural traditions are relevant to data protection, which is one reason why I think developing audit criteria for data protection, privacy is not only is it an important exercise in for all the reasons that Ryan and others have laid out for why independent audit is important, but in many ways it's a way for those of us in that community to reflect on a more concrete level how different value orientations shape our expectations of boundaries.
And then just to add to what Andy and Enrico said about the impact on our autonomy. So if someone knows enough about you or infers enough about you or has insight about you, this really impacts your ability to critically think and to have your own ability to make decisions. And so that is why it is quite important that we need to understand the context of which our privacy is, and our data and the information and insight and influence is being used about us as well. Because fundamentally, it's a holistic aspect. And we have data that can contain maybe not data necessarily about us, but echoes about people. And so therefore, for the idea of protecting both people and planet here, we need to understand how we're operating in this privacy space, how our data is going to be used, how the AI systems are going to use that data, and what decisions are going to be made about that data based about that AI system and about us ultimately impacting people and planet, as I mentioned before. So,
thank you, Trish. I'm going to move us on from privacy, so we've got time to reach the Q&A at the end. We still have 2 more pillars to speak about. So let's move on to cybersecurity. And Andy, I'm curious, what's needed to protect our AI systems from cyber attack?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that we are still asking and struggling to answer around non-AI systems. I think it is tempting to treat AI as this distinct kind of standalone vertical. I myself am, somewhat guilty of this. When, in most respects, AI systems are extensions of the kind of legacy IT that, we've been operating for many, many, many decades yet, and frankly haven't quite cracked the code yet on how best to optimize benefits, risks, and establish governance frameworks. So I think this is true not just of cybersecurity for AI, but perhaps some of the other dimensions as well. And I'd love to hear other panelists weigh in on this. But not everything about AI is new, right? And it's all so data protection, right, is a conversation we've been having, since at least the 1970s, and bias. There are all sorts of incumbent legal traditions and frameworks for how organizations deal with bias. And the challenge, I think, is in many ways is thinking through, okay, where are there gaps or deficiencies in sort of the baseline way we think about cybersecurity, bias, data protection, as a result of whatever new attributes, as a result of unique attributes of AI that we have to fill in. So to me, I mean, that's a kind of a framing, that I, try to keep top of mind, because again, I think, at a policy level, right, there is this drive to sort of create this AI policy vertical. And what I love about Audit is I mean, yes, we're talking about auditing AI systems, whether that's for cybersecurity or some, one of the other pillars. But we're specific enough where, in many cases, if you dive into some of the criteria that we've been developing, you could ask the same questions of non-AI systems, and that's a strength, right? I mean, ultimately, AI systems are going to be operating alongside or even on top of legacy systems, and we have to think about these systems holistically if we're going to manage AI risk, let alone digital risk more broadly. One advantage we have when it comes to AI systems that we no longer have when it comes to legacy incumbent non-AI systems is that AI systems are still maturing. And so we have an opportunity to build, for example, cybersecurity in from the very beginning. that I think is less a challenge of audit criteria, more a question of incentives, market or legal incentives for organizations to bake security into products from the beginning. Audit can help by providing, help drive those incentives by either helping regulators identify, concrete ways to actually, legislate, which is, about as strong an incentive as a company can face. Or in other cases, contractual partners, business partners can look at audit and, sort of answer, that Russian proverb, trust but verify. I think last point I'll make on security, and I think, I forget who it was who mentioned this at the top of our section, but maybe it was you, Joe, that AI systems are not static, right? They're evolving constantly. And I have to apologize. I have, it's morning here in California, and as if on cue, our gardener has arrived with a lawnmower. So if you hear any noise in the background, I don't live next to an airport. I actually have a lawnmower outside. So nothing is static, and there's a need for continuous monitoring because an audit that is produced at time 0, at time 1 may no longer be applicable anymore. And this problem is especially acute in cybersecurity, where you have a threat actor, right? So not only is the AI system itself not static, but you have an adversarial environment where the threat actors are also continually adapting, continually honing their tradecraft, and establishing some form of continuous monitoring, I think, is vitally important. We would never, to come back to the illustrative example that Ryan used, and I thought it was very helpful video at the top of our session on financial services. It's not like we simply accept a bank's financial statements as the last word on their financing. I mean, there's this ecosystem, right, of continuous monitoring that includes audit, but also all sorts of other transparency mechanisms. And thinking about where audit fits in to a broader regime of continuous monitoring for AI systems, I think is vitally important. And I will stop there and spare you all this motor running in the background.
We don't hear the motor so much, don't worry, Andy. Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. So I'm going to move us on to our final pillar, which really brings together, all of the rest of the discussion that we've had, I think, and especially in light of the fact that AI, as we've been talking about, is the evolution of many moving parts. It's a system itself that changes, an environment that changes with changing threats. So Sarah, let's move to you. How is it that we can build trust in AI? What are the dimensions that we must be considering?
Yeah, no pressure. It's
easy one. Tell us the answer.
I mean, speaking to Andy, because I came up through IT and security and info security, so trust but verify was, stamped through me like a stick of rock. I don't know whether that reference is going to play out internationally, but anyway, it used to be Candy, where you had letters in the middle of it, and those were the letters. One of the main things that brought me to ForHumanity, and before that drove me towards looking at AI-related risks, was actually a sister phenomena I had observed that was eroding trust, which is increasingly it was getting very hard to get a person on the phone when something went wrong, whether it was to do with your Netflix subscription or to do with your taxes or to do with your benefits or to do with anything else. There was a persistent journey going on where there was potentially grit or length added into the redress machine. So the time it took you to be able to get through to a human being in order to talk about a complaint. And that was such a fundamental erosion of trust. And of course, what was meeting that coming head on was the reason that trust was eroding was that there was so much effort to standardize those interactions, to really drill them down to having someone with minimal feasible skills and the most standardized script to deal with it, to cut costs, is exactly where AI stepped in. To feed that back into our context, the reason why it's so closely related to trust is because we abdicate accountability for our well-being to these companies, into the organizations who are running AI. And we cannot trust unless there is, through some mechanism which is outside our control, accountability and transparency and explainability and a right to redress and some independent oversight of those things, both existing and operating. So of those elements that I've mentioned, all of the other things that we've discussed today play a part in it. It really, trust has to exist through the whole stack. Internally, I've worked around vendor in change governance a lot, and it is a thankless task. And you are always playing catch up with that desire to go live as soon as possible with whatever state a system is in, because there's a market advantage to be obtained. So what you need to do is you need to be able to foster trust right through your organization, from the executive through the second line of internal audit, down through to the operational oversight, down through to the coalface. You have to have trust between all those layers, but you cannot have trust without accountability. You cannot have people whose job it is to care, and people can't be accountable for something they can't influence and don't understand. So really, it's the establishment of the accountability, the means to explain what the potential risks are to those people internally, so they are able to influence towards a better position. You incentivize that through ensuring that accountability is externally audited. That needs to be leaning on a pillar of legislation or regulation that is enforceable and enforced. And there needs to be consistency and understanding in both the practitioners of the audit and the practitioners inside the businesses. To a bunch of points that you guys were all making about, we cannot expect people to be accountable for their safety in terms of the usage of AI, because they cannot influence it and they don't understand. So we are taking on the role of establishing that infrastructure of trust through education, through identifying who's accountable and getting the correct demarcation. You can't have somebody whose quarterly bonus is dependent on putting as much data as possible through an AI and ask them to be accountable for managing all the risks identified by internal audit. That just doesn't work. So we create those constructive accountability linkage points, those bodies who can stand to the side of the operational churn and inject the understanding, the transparency, the accountability, and the means to manage those risks, all of which add up to being able to trust those AIs. And a massive piece of that in the audit, which is different to other things that I've historically worked with, is building on encouragement in the EU AI Act around disclosure, actively disclosing to the general public where you're making key ethical choices. So those communities into which you're delivering these things are advised about the judgment calls you're making on their behalf. And the other key facet of this is bringing in diverse stakeholders, both diverse in terms of the inputs they can provide and diverse in terms of where they sit in the population. Are they representative of the people who are potentially impacted? Because we may think that we're doing no harm and that we've minimized risks, but most of the time we're missing something. So we bring those people in to help us understand the potential for adverse outcomes in their sphere of experience, in their lived experience, and we inject that in at the start of process to understand the benchmarks for ethics and for trust that we're looking for outcomes to manage against.
That's a fantastically comprehensive answer, Sarah, that really highlights the multifaceted nature of trust. You know, there's so many dimensions that we must consider. So before we open for the audience Q&A, would the other panelists like to share kind of their closing thoughts on these topics? Enrico, would you like to start?
No, not so much, but I wanted us also to put together two different things. What Andy was saying about cybersecurity, that is very related of what Patricia is saying about privacy, and that is bringing from a technical point of view to a cognitive point of view to the statistical bias or cognitive bias, and all these is laying on a bed river of ethics and is going through what Sarah is proposing, the trust. So every pillar has got a goal. They are not. We are doing an independent audit, but not. They are not independent. They are very related between each other. So I think that we are complementary in our work for creating the best possible kind of audit. So that's only this one. And another thing about cybersecurity, I was thinking about the Maslow pyramid. I don't like it generally, but for me it's very important that an audit could not attack the physiology of a company. So we should not block the business of the company. That's what companies are afraid of. And at the same time, the first thing we have to do, we have to make it secure, safe. So what Andy is talking about cybersecurity, that is historical now, is really true. We have to give this base of security to build everything else later. So, but it's from an economical point of view, and that's it. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Enrico. Andy, you're nodding along. What would you like to add?
No, I thought Enrique said it well. I guess I will just wrap my thoughts up with just a reiteration of this point that that AI systems are going to exist alongside legacy systems for a really long time, and one of the real benefits of the approach that ForHumanity has taken to really dive deep into audit criteria is helping aligning risk management of AI systems with risk management of legacy systems. And I think, in the process, shining a pretty bright spotlight on the one hand, how relatively mature the standards down to audit criteria domain is for IT. But at the same time, I think raising all sorts of questions around where are the incentives going to come from for businesses and vendors to actually, seek an independent audit. And it's that incentives question that I think is in many ways, perhaps the easiest to solve, in the sense that, a regulator could simply say, "Thou shalt audit." But in that sense, it's also particularly hard because it requires a government to step up and mandate. And I think ForHumanity is ready to answer that call, if and hopefully when it comes.
Thank you, Andy. Shea, do you have any wrapping up thoughts on the topic of trust that you would like to share?
Well, I think, our job definitely is trying to marry that business interest, which is trust, user trust, right? And that's, if you're talking about incentives for corporations to, let's say, have an independent audit, is building trust with external stakeholders and the people who use their products. What we're trying to do is build the bridge between that trust and the idea of trustworthiness, and making sure that not the system. One thing that people might notice in this whole conversation, that the name is independent audit of AI systems, we're really talking mostly about the companies which are creating and deploying these systems. And it's ensuring that those companies have processes in place that make them trustworthy, and that we can trust that they are doing what they say they're doing, and that the AI is doing what they say it does. And that's the role that this independent audit can play. Even absent of regulations, if you want to build trust with the people who use your product, and it's definitely being eroded. Just open up the news on any given day, and there's something negative about AI. And so there is a business opportunity and a business motivation for this. And our role is to make sure that that trust is justified.
Fantastic points, Shea. Trish, what would you like to add?
Just that I think we've demonstrated that in order to ascertain performance and try and to adhere to the standard that is set in the audit rules, it takes an interdisciplinary approach with interdisciplinary facets. And we are looking at the AI audit from all these different facets of the ethics, the bias, the privacy, the trust, the cybersecurity. And there are many more within our own kind of structures that we've created within the audit rules themselves. But these are the fundamentals at the very heart of it. So I think it's that interdisciplinary approach, and obviously it's multifaceted. So it's needing all of these aspects to give you that holistic view of what's going on.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left for audience questions. So I'll look now at the Q&A box. I see we've had quite a few come in. So we'll start at the top. First question that we have is, should AI system end users have some agency in choosing which type of ethics they're consenting to being subjected to? Who would like to speak to this one? Enrico, I can see you.
I was already trying to answer all the questions, because the majority are always about ethics, because it's not well defined. And generally in debate, you are listening to people saying, I don't want that because I don't like it. That's not an ethical approach at all. In ethics, we have instruments, tools, models that we use to cope with the ethical dilemma. And so just in this case, I'm talking about data ethics, and I'm taking a very clear level of abstraction. And when I'm considering everything data that is transformed into information. And from this point of view, I'm not putting the man in the middle of my debate, but using only the network between the agents, human agents that use information as a resource to have a product, and that process will change our environment, so the infosphere. So in reality, in ethics, we have the instruments, but generally they are misused or not well known. So I think that we are afraid of saying that everybody has got a different ethics. That's not true, because everybody in small group or larger group has got some point of contact every time, and what we have to do is to find which point of contact we have to use, and not to have a straight rule like in laws. We need laws, but that's not ethics. And we have soft laws that will help us to build something ethical. So I think I answered.
Thank you, Enrico. So we have a couple of questions that were shared before the session. I see we do have very thorough ethics coverage in the questions, so I'm going to go to one of the ones asked beforehand. So, won't audit slow down innovation? Do we see audit actually being at odds with technological innovation in the field of AI?
I'll take that one and then I'll hand off to Andy. I think it's innovation is about pushing the boundaries, trying to get stuff out there that solves problems, and experimenting, trying them out live. an audit shouldn't prevent those things. What it should be doing is setting out foundations and scaffolding for not going ahead and causing what people have deemed to be an extreme of adverse outcomes in the process of doing those things. And certainly as things enter at the real bleeding edges of development, that experimentation is a necessity to develop them into anything that resembles a product. But also at that stage, the harms usually haven't escalated to a point where it needs to have some guardrails. So people may decide that the audit isn't a desirable guardrail for the point they are at. And that's the place where really you need legislators and regulators to step in, because we are looking at the common good, and you know, how many adverse outcomes are too many in exchange for the benefits of the innovation. So it's not whether it stops innovation, it's whether there are a level of adverse outcomes that require some guardrails so it can carry on at the pace it desires to without hurting too many people. It's trade-offs, essentially, and that's a big part of the trust and accountability conversation.
All in the trade-offs. Andy, what do you say?
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. There's a trade, yeah, and I think Sarah's point about trade-offs is spot on. That is a trope that you will hear time and time again in debates about regulatory policy for digital systems. And this is true of incumbent IT systems as well. And I think it's useful to interrogate in these debates what we mean by innovation. And I think what many who deploy that argument to attack initiatives like, developing independent audit for AI systems is they mean unbridled innovation. And unbridled innovation is a bad idea. We support innovation as societies because we want innovation to solve problems and enhance quality of life, and unbridled innovation does not necessarily satisfy those objectives. And so putting guardrails, to use Sarah's phraseology, around innovation, I think is really important. And yes, that will slow things down in some cases, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do think, though, that whenever we talk about building costs into the way that companies do business, we have to be mindful of those costs and what that means for the competitive environment. We've seen this with the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, where larger companies are in a better position to comply with it than smaller companies, and it has, I think, had some impact on the ability of new entrants to come in and innovate and challenge the incumbents. That's a risk, and I think that we ought to bear in mind and think through. But this idea that unbridled innovation is an unvarnished good, I think, is outlived its usefulness.
Thank you, Andy. Really important that we, keep this protection for humanity, and moderate the pace of innovation so that we are sure that we are actually doing the best that we can for humanity. So with that, let's wrap up this panel. Thank you all very much, panelists. Thank you, audience, for attending and all of your questions. Please answer the poll questions. Let us know what is your opinion about independent audit, having now listened to all of the facets in this discussion, and let us know in the chat what your thoughts are. But for now, we'll give you a few minutes break before the next session, so you've got time to get refreshed and come back ready for the next one. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Joe. Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
What is ForHumanity? We are a nonprofit charitable organization built for a singular mission: to examine and analyze downside risk associated